Morning. Okay, it is 9, so we'll go ahead and get started. We are few but mighty today. It looks like. Good morning. I think everybody's just sort of not enjoying the storm, things along those lines. I'm wearing leggings. I promise. I'm not trying to flash anybody. I realized when I post my videos that I think I made it worse. It's always the camera lens gets really fogged up. And so I look like, I don't know, I'm in a cloud or something. So hopefully that's a little better for those of you who are either reviewing the videos later or on now. And just a quick reminder, if you do miss a class, where you can find those. So if you go to recordings of lectures, last year I posted these individually after every class and I got really bad at it. I just would forget to put them on Blackboard. So what I did this time is I just created a YouTube playlist of all the lectures. So if you click, you'll just see them all right here and you can find the date that you need. All righty. Well, I was gonna have y'all do an activity, but I think I'm gonna hold my horses just because there's about a third to half of the class who isn't here. And I'd rather give more people opportunity to do it. I realized last night when I suffered one of my occasional bouts of insomnia that I never finished the gender lecture. There's not much, but I do feel obligated to actually go through this with y'all real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up and throw on the captions. Alrighty, so we had been talking about various forms of birth control and how effective or not effective they are, and also how awful some of them are, like we talked about. For some people, IUDs, getting them in is really problematic. You know, if you are not using any contraception, the failure rate is about 85%. That doesn't mean the first time you have sex, you're 85% likely to get pregnant. It just means if you have sex at a time where in theory you can get pregnant, it's more likely to do that. I just realized I should some nice air quality in here today. Alrighty. The fun slide I missed was STDs, which are sometimes now called STIs, for sexually transmitted infections. And so these are just things that we need to be aware of. I actually heard recently that I believe it's syphilis is making a comeback in the US. So go team, I don't know. Basically what happened is a lot of people were sort of isolated during the pandemic. And then now that people are back outside a little bit, a whole bunch of things are coming back that have kind of been gone for a while. And then new viruses like monkeypox are finding easy transmission. So I think a lot of people know about acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. The more common version that more people have is human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. AIDS is sort of the late stage HIV. So essentially, when you're diagnosed with HIV. AIDS is where essentially your body's starting to shut down, things along those lines. We'll talk about this more when we get to the health psych chapter, but when I was in grad school, I actually worked in an HIV clinic for about 3 months, and there's, as you can imagine, a lot of psychological ramifications for folks who are first diagnosed, things along those lines. Chlamydia is a bacteria, and it relates to painful urination. HPV got a lot of press in the past 10, 15 years. So HPV is related to genital warts, but it's also one of the few infectious diseases that we can link directly to a cancer. So it's linked to cervical cancer. And this is why the HPV vaccine has been pushed so much, because it's essentially a vaccine that can prevent a cancer, which is kind of amazing. But of course, as we talked about in our gender discussion, people were like, oh no, my child can't get an HPV vaccine because that gives them license to have sex. No, it just protects them, heaven forbid something happen. Gonorrhea, cloudy discharge, burning sensation. Again, none of these are pleasant, right? Herpes are painful red bumps. Crabs or pubic lice. It's just like lice for this hair, only down there. Not pleasant. As I mentioned, syphilis is making a comeback. Syphilis, like HIV as it develops into AIDS, can affect you cognitively. It can actually create symptoms that look like mental illness. Late stage AIDS can actually create a form of dementia. And so these are not things you want to get. Trick, you have unpleasant discharge, sore and irritated. For some of these things, like if you're in a heterosexual relationship, one partner may be asymptomatic and then not know they have it and give it to the other partner. And this is a case where like the men may be asymptomatic. And then hepatitis also, I feel like, is getting more press because there are new drugs to treat it. This, like HIV AIDS, is something that can be transmitted sexually, but also through blood. So people who share needles, things along those lines, will also be at risk for hepatitis. And I feel like we kind of covered this, but I just want to make sure that I I covered this super fun STD slide. And so today we're going to start talking about Freud. Alrighty, let me go ahead and get this into slideshow mode and then put on the captions in this one. And then probably Wednesday, I'm hoping with the weather calming down, more people will be able to get to class either online or in person. We'll go ahead and do there's a personality inventory y'all are gonna do, and it will give you instant results about your personality traits. So, okay, so this Freud is the granddaddy of all personality theorists. He is who we think of when we think of psychology a lot of the times. He's in pop culture a lot, right? He is still really carried on in other fields, in particular English really likes him and uses his theories a lot. In psychology, there's a lot of healthy skepticism about his theories, while at the same time acknowledging that had he not done what he did in terms of theorizing about personality and development and psychopathology, we wouldn't be where we are as a field. He really got everything kick-started. And again, a lot of his ideas are no longer accepted, but he's really respected because he's one of the few people who tried to explain everything about psychology. And also he really is the founder of talk therapy. So as I mentioned, when we were doing the history section, for me as a clinical psychologist, like going and seeing like the couch where he did the first therapy felt weirdly like some sort of religious experience, right? Like this is where it started. All right, so we're going to introduce Freud and his theories through one of his famous case studies, that of Anna O. By way of background, Freud was a medical doctor, so he wasn't a PhD in psychology. At the time that he was theorizing, people who had PhDs in psychology were not treating people yet. They were in research labs. They were, the structuralists and the functionalists. They were a little more abstract and hands-off. So Freud had an MD, and he actually studied neurology. And he was actually more interested in kind of digging into things more philosophically, but essentially you need to make money somehow, right? And so seeing patients was how he paid the bills. And actually he ended up benefiting from that because patients like Anna O helped him to formulate his theories. So after he got his MD, Freud initially practiced as a neurologist. Over time, due to his changing interests, and also again, a lot of times what happens in our capitalistic society is you do what you have to do to get by. He needed to pay those bills. Freud became more interested in treatment of what at the time were called nervous disorders or hysterias. And so essentially at that time, there were a lot more people with these nervous disorders than there were people with like neurological issues, at least that we knew of. So in the 1880s, Freud made the acquaintance of another physician named Joseph Breuer, and they began working together. Breuer had been treating Anna O. And again, this is a pseudonym. This is not the woman's real name. This was to protect her as they wrote about her publicly. And she was suffering from what was at that time called hysteria. It was alternately referred to as hysterical neurosis. And it is a neurosis characterized by physical symptoms. It's a singular, but it could also be plural, that have no physical basis. So if you do every medical test known to humanity, you're not going to find anything physiologically wrong with them. Instead, it is their psychological stress manifesting in these physical ways. Today, this would be within what we call the somatic symptom disorders or conversion disorder. Hysteria was the the name, the nomenclature of the day. And again, to remind us, the word hyster is the Greek word for uterus. And prior to Freud, they didn't think this at Freud's time, but people used to truly think the uterus wandered around the body, implanted itself in different places, and that's why, like, your arm would be numb or paralyzed. So back then, they thought that hysteria was the result of a traumatic seduction before puberty. It was thought that the conflict the individual experienced was a function of poorly repressed sexual desires. And so the idea was, how can we help this person work through these psychological issues so that their physical symptoms will resolve? So Anna O had fallen ill during a period of stress. Her father was very ill, and she was the one in charge of his care. She was a caregiver, basically nursing him. And her disturbance manifested as a host of symptoms. All right, well, hang on now, hypnosis. All right, so some of her symptoms included numbness in her right arm and leg, which they sometimes call anesthesia of the right arm and leg, because it's almost like you've been given some sort of anesthetic. Restrictions in her field of vision, so she didn't have full binocular vision like a typical human does. She had difficulty recognizing people she knew. And even though she was born and raised in Germany and that was her native tongue, she could only speak in English. She couldn't remember how to speak in German anymore. So a whole complex constellation of symptoms that were physiological, but everything Breuer did, everything Freud did to analyze them, found no physiological roots. She didn't have a stroke or anything like that. So Breuer had been treating her using hypnosis, and this was really innovative. Breuer was the first person to do this in this way. So it had been used for treatment for some physical disorders prior to this. And they knew that suggestibility played a part in how successful hypnosis is. And there was an emerging awareness that patients suffering from hysteria were extremely suggestible. So the idea was, we know hypnosis works in people who are suggestible. People with hysteria are suggestible. This is a potentially successful treatment for hysteria. And just like a quick side note, hypnosis is still used today and can be used still to treat especially physical pain. I had a graduate professor who integrated hypnosis with some of the modern evidence-based therapies, and he would treat people with chronic pain, with TMJ, which is like a jaw pain disorder, and had a lot of success with it. So when you hypnotize someone, you put them into what's called a trance state. And when Breuer hypnotized Anna O, she was able to recall experiences and events that she was unaware of when she was not hypnotized, when she was not in the trance. Moreover, the feelings she experienced and connections with these events were vivid and powerful. So she had very strong emotional reactions. Breuer found that when he had Anna O express these painful feelings while in the hypnotic trance, she came out of the trance feeling greatly relieved. And repeated application of this treatment actually resulted in a cure, essentially. And Anna was actually the one to initially call it the talking cure. Which is what sort of the common vernacular for psychotherapy became, and it came from Anna. And so out of this were the roots of what eventually came to be called psychoanalysis, which was the type of therapy that Freud developed. So for Freud, the case of Anna O, and then he started to see other similar cases. He saw a lot of people that had sort of this pattern, raised several serious questions. The answers he came up with laid the foundations for his theory of personality. So while in the trance state, Anna O recalled events she was unaware of in her normal waking state. So where were those memories residing? Well, to Freud, he proposed the concept of the unconscious. And one thing I'll say here, like side note, is that in common vernacular in movies, this has been made into the subconscious, but Freud really meant unconscious. So if we think of something as subconscious, it's just underneath our conscious awareness. It kind of implies we could get there fairly easily. Unconscious means it's literally outside of our conscious awareness, where there's no way, unless certain pretty drastic steps are taken, that we know what's going on. So Freud suggested that feelings of which the patient was unaware and could not express in their normal waking state lived in this realm of the unconscious in the mind. And although these events and feelings were unconscious, so again, outside of conscious awareness, they continue to exert an influence on the patient. Sometimes it was just their mental state, and sometimes, like Anna O and some of the other patients he worked with, they manifested physically as well. Thinking about the unconscious and the manifestations that we see, Freud also came up with this idea of intrapsychic conflict. He proposed there must be a conflict between the forces that push for the expression of that unconscious material and forces that prevent the expression of that. He said, if there wasn't something trying to prevent it, all the unconscious stuff would find a way out, basically. But because it clearly wasn't coming out, when it came out in these like weird physical ways, he said there's got to be something pushing down on it. So for that, he suggested there's an intrapsychic conflict between forces for expression and repression. And now psychoanalysis is Freud's therapeutic technique, but his theory is often referred to as psychodynamic. And dynamic is a term that he specifically chose because he wanted to make his theory like thermodynamics and physics. He wanted to make it scientific, and he thought about these forces in the mind, and that term dynamic made sense to him for the mind as much as it did for physics. Freud proposed that one of the things that helped keep the unconscious material in the unconscious was defense mechanisms. And these are barriers or ways that we cope so that these unconscious things don't come out and disrupt our lives. The most powerful of those, the most basic of those is repression. It's the prototype of all the defense mechanisms. Because the feelings that people are experiencing unconsciously are painful, Freud proposed there must be some force within the patient that essentially squashes, pushes down, represses these painful feelings out of awareness. So this became the root of his theory of neurosis. Again, remember this, what was happening with Anna O was called hysterical neurosis at the time. So Freud thought painful feelings, if denied proper expression, if they were not allowed to come out, if they're being repressed, may be expressed what he termed symbolically. So they come out in these other ways rather than in really obvious ways. So as you may have heard before, Freud believed there were three aspects of personality. These are three forces within the mind, those dynamic forces within the mind that were in conflict with each other. And the first of which, the most primal of which, is the id. This is the primitive, instinctual component of personality. It's an inexhaustible reservoir of wishes, impulses, and strivings, which continually press for release through some action of the organism. So to Freud, the id is the force trying to press out of the unconscious, and there are other forces trying to keep it down. So there's this constant press for release from these id wishes and impulses, and that creates tension. And the id functions in such a manner that it wants to just discharge the tension immediately and return the organism to a more comfortable state. And here's what Freud termed the pleasure principle comes into play. So essentially, the pleasure principle demands immediate gratification of those instincts, wishes, desires. So I want what I want, and I want it right now. My graduate professor that I took theories of personality with had a great way of talking about the id. He said it's like Cookie Monster. And it's like, me want cookie, me want sex, right? The idea that it's not gonna like have a filter. It's gonna try to push out and take. And the id engages in what's called primary process thinking, according to Freud. So it attempts to discharge this tension by forming an image of the object that will remove the tension. So mental images are the only reality the id knows because it's not allowed to just express itself. So for example, a hungry person, they might be imagining a Whopper from Burger King. If you're vegetarian, you're imagining the Impossible Whopper, right? And you know that the image of the Whopper will not cure hunger pangs. So same thing with other things for the id. The id wants to just say, do whatever it wants. It can imagine it, but it's not allowed to express it. So it doesn't actually resolve it. Just like imagining a Whopper doesn't sedate your hunger, right? That's where the ego comes in. So the ego comes into existence because of the inability of the id to get rid of that tension entirely by itself. So again, that hungry person has that image of the Whopper, and in the real world, the individual has to match the mental image of the food with the food in order to get rid of that hunger, right? And reduce that tension. So the ego serves as an individual's adaptive function. Essentially, it mediates between the id and the real world. And it mediates between the individual's needs and reality. The ego operates according to what Freud called the reality principle. In other words, it seeks to delay gratification of the id's urges until the appropriate time and place. So again, you're hungry, you want a Whopper, you're gonna get in your car, you're gonna drive to Burger King up on Newtown, right? You're not just gonna go ravaging through the calf, being like, where's the Whoppers? Like Cookie Monster, right? That's the idea here. So it uses what's called secondary process thinking, rational, realistic, problem-oriented, but also problem-solving in nature. It strives to avoid negative consequences from society by behaving properly. Again, I'm going to be patient and drive to get what I want rather than just tearing through everything. So if you're that hungry person with that mental image of the Whopper, you're going to go and you're going to sit in the drive-through line and you're going to wait, right? You're not going to like ram the other cars in front of you. You're going to pay for your meal before you pull away. To Freud, the ego was what made you go through all those appropriate steps. But Freud argued that even the ego was not quite enough. And so people also developed the superego, and the superego is the moral component of personality. So the ego just kind of gets you to do what looks appropriate. The superego really is trying to get people to think about things in terms of right and wrong. So this emerges from the ego around 3 to 5 years of age, Freud argued. And an example here is that kids unknowingly, kids are still learning about things, may pick up a pack of gum or candy and walk out of the store with it. They're not trying to steal, they just don't get that I have to pay for it. So, early kids would climb into the car and just start eating the candy right in front of their parents. The parent would be like, "Where'd you get that? We didn't pay for that," right? Because again, they don't recognize it's wrong. The idea is if you have a developed super ego and you still take it, bless you, you would hide it from your parents and secretly eat it later. It doesn't mean that you are moral, but that you're aware of society's moral standings. So in the first scenario, you basically haven't fully developed a super ego. And in the second, you have that super ego and you've internalized that stealing is wrong. So again, the super ego is not always going to get you to do what's right, but you might feel guilty about it, right? So some key points here. All three components of the personality, the id, the ego, and the superego, are going to interact to produce the behavior that we observe in people. And these interactions typically involve an ongoing series of internal conflicts that we're not aware of but pop up. So to Freud, the id was entirely in the unconscious. The ego and the superego kind of straddle it. And so there's a lot going on outside of our conscious awareness. I always thought this was really interesting. So Freud himself never mapped this onto the brain. To him, this was in the mind, which was like somehow in the brain, but like there wasn't exact neuroanatomy that matched up to this. So this is just sort of a nice diagram that tries to do that. And it puts the id down by the brainstem, which is like the most primitive part of our brain. The brainstem does things like help us breathe and regulate body and things along those lines. But again, just know that Freud himself didn't draw this diagram. But the idea is that the superego is your conscience, it's your little Jiminy Cricket, and it's driven by moral principles. The ego is your mediator, so it's trying to mediate between the superego, the id, but then also like everything going on around outside of you. So the ego tries to be logical and rational, and is driven by that reality principle. And then the id is illogical, it's emotional, it's irrational, just wants what it wants, and it wants it now. And it's driven by the pleasure principle. And so these interpsychic conflicts are basically just always going on. All right, and so now what we have are some scenarios what might happen. And we can kind of think about how the id, the ego, and the superego would react here. So Rachel is walking to class and the late bell rang 2 minutes ago. She's probably in high school. As she walks into class, she stumbles and her books go flying everywhere. Out of one of the books is a note to a boy that Rachel has secretly liked for a long time. The boy picks up the note and reads the top line and hands it back to Rachel. She is so embarrassed. So the id in this scenario would probably just want to like literally run and hide to avoid that uncomfortable situation. Or if we're going to the other extreme, it might just sort of like jump on this boy that she likes, right? Start trying to kiss him. Consent is important, right? Don't do that. The ego would try to sort of like, let's think of this in a logical, rational way. How do we handle it? Maybe we pretend that didn't happen, right? And we just sort of pick up our books and go sit. And then the super ego here, we'll be thinking, well, you know, if you had been to class on time and you weren't rushing, this never would have happened. So this is really your fault. So just don't do that again. Things along those lines. All right, here's another one. Jake is going on his first date with a really popular girl. He still can't believe that she agreed to go out with him. During the movie, they're sitting so close that their legs are touching, and he so badly wants to hold her hand and kiss her. Oh, this is so pure. He isn't sure how she would react. He takes a chance and does it, and she looks at him and then gets up and walks out. Okay. So a whole bunch of different things could be going on. You know, again, here the id would be like, yeah, grab her hand, kiss her, it's great, go for it. This super ego would be like, no, you need to really make sure that this is appropriate and she's okay with this and that maybe you're not doing it in a public place. And then the ego is just trying to like read all the signs and be logical and kind of come out with it, right? And so in this scenario, maybe she thought that this was like a friend thing that happens. I suddenly, like a couple months ago, remembered a friend of mine calling me and asking me to the movies when I was in high school. I was like, yeah, who else should we invite? And he was kind of like, and I got off the phone, my mom was like, he was asking you for a date. And I was like, what? Right? Like sometimes we don't get the signals, right? So that could be what's going on here. All right, here's another one. Jessica is babysitting for the same family she babysits for every Friday night. This Friday night, however, she invited her boyfriend over and they are snuggling on the couch watching a movie. The parents come home early and find Jessica and her boyfriend wrapped up in each other's arms and sound asleep. They wake them up and are so upset because they felt Jessica was irresponsible. Jessica's really upset and not sure what to think or say. So just first of all, picking up on that last sentence, Freud would argue there's a lot of interpsychic conflict going on, and that's why Jessica doesn't know how to react in the moment, right? So like her forces are trying to sort it all out. The id here would be like, yeah, come on over. I want to have my boyfriend. It's comfortable. It makes me happy. Let's do it. The super ego would be like, no, this is wrong. They're trusting you. Don't do this. Again, it's kind of interesting to think of them as like an angel on one shoulder, a devil on the other, right? And then the ego would be like, okay, let's think of a rational way that we can resolve this. In this case, it seems like her id won out. And so now she's struggling to try to figure out, how to respond to this family that probably is, again, if you're middle school, high school, probably a big part of your income at that point in time, right? Alrighty, so we're going to switch gears here for just a moment. And Freud really focused on early childhood as a very important time period. In fact, he believed that the first 5 years of life in particular were decisive for personality development. And at this time, he thought that you could get stuck at a stage of development, and then that would lead to you developing a not fully healthy personality. And that was what he called fixation. And then regression would be when you kind of go back to that stage later in life when something stressful comes up. And that'll make a lot more sense as we go through these stages that Freud came up with. So one thing that I need to say before we dive into the psychosexual stages is that this, even for people who were contemporaries of Freud, so people who were around at the same time Freud was, this part of Freud's theory is what the most people disagreed with back then, what most people disagree with now from his theories. Just a quick little bit of background about Freud. When Freud's mom had him, she was about 19 or 20. His dad was 40. His mom, by all reports, was very attractive and kind to Freud. His dad was sort of aloof and distant. So I think that kind of helps think about some of these things. And so he said, in the course of normal development, the personality passes through a number of well-defined stages until it reaches maturity. And the ideal is you just pass through each of these, you resolve each stage, and you get to maturity and you have a healthy, functional personality. But Freud argued that that doesn't always happen. And that's where you get a lot of the issues that he ended up seeing with his therapeutic clients. So the first stage, and one thing I will say is that depending on the book you look in, depending on the source you're looking at, you will see the ages for these kind of vary. So like, for example, I've seen the oral stage being like 0 to 1.5. I've seen Palette stopping at 5 or going to 6. It kind of doesn't matter exact ages. What I want you to know for a test is like the order in which you progress through these and what each one relates to. So the oral stage is getting pleasure through the mouth. So what, if you hand something to a baby, what's the first thing they usually do with it? Put it in their mouth, right? And this is why we don't give babies small things, right? Because we're afraid they're gonna choke on them. Yeah, so again, these stages do have some grounding in ideas, reality, observations. But where Freud took it weirdly is he made everything kind of sexual. And this is where, again, every other theorist was like, no. So he thought that not only were kids exploring with their mouth, but they were getting pleasure, gratification through that. And he argued that the key task to go out of this stage into the next stage was weaning. So learning to eat solid foods, no longer being dependent on the breast or the bottle. The next stage was the anal stage. And here Freud said that the pleasure was through the anus by retaining and expulsing feces. That, either by letting it out or holding it in, that would somehow bring gratification. So obviously the key task here is toilet training. Again, you navigate that successfully, you move on to the next stage. So the next stage is really the one where people were like, Freud, what? Again, even people who were around at the same time Freud was. And this is the phallic stage. And he argued that males develop what is called the Oedipal conflict or the Oedipal complex, where boys are sexually attracted to their mothers and hates their fathers because they view them as rivals for their mother's love. But boys fear that their fathers will retaliate against them by castrating them. And so Freud actually came up with the term castration anxiety to describe this anxiety, which motivates the boys to put aside the desire for the mother and identify with their fathers. And to Freud, it was during this stage that the boys develop their super ego because they come to identify with their father's value system. Really interestingly, Freud himself just kind of said, oh yeah, and then girls kind of do the same thing, it's fine. And later theorists were like, no way, like we need to actually think about this. So in particular, one of Freud's students, disciples, Carl Jung, fleshed this out more. And he said females during this stage realize they do not have a penis and develop what's called penis envy. This was like largely symbolic for Freud. So we talked about the penis as a phallus, as a symbol of power. And at this time, girls develop an attraction for their father. Again, here we go with these weird incestual ideas, in hopes that he will give them the penis they so badly desire. And Jung called this the electric complex. Freud just used the idea of it was the Oedipal complex for everybody. And he argued that girls cannot have castration anxiety because they have no penis. And so the idea was they're unable to get over this penis envy. And Freud argued that girls never developed a superego as a result. So he argued that grown women continue to have penis envy and never develop a strong superego, which leads them to rely more on emotion than reason. This part has always like boggled my mind a little bit because Freud was living in Victorian Austria. And if you know anything about Victorian times, the women were very much the people who were like enforcing social regulations and what was morally right. And the men were too, but it was like the women were, if anyone's seen Bridgerton, it's kind of a similar vibe, right? Where like the women are the ones spreading the gossip and kind of controlling things through relational aggression. So again, the idea was once you identify with your same-sex parents, then you have navigated this successfully. Again, a lot of people were like, no, Freud, no. And to this day, this is one of the big issues. Just quick side note, to give you some historical reference, the idea of the Oedipal conflict comes from the play Oedipus, which is a Greek tragedy where Oedipus is exiled from his home and returns many years later. doesn't know who he is, and so ends up killing his father and marrying his mother, but he doesn't know she's his mom. And when he finds out, he like goes out and blinds himself. It's a very dramatic, right? And an interesting way to think about how 3 to 6 year olds navigate the world. Again, I want to like take 5 steps back and be like, where could Freud have gotten some of these ideas? Certainly at this age, kids are exploring their bodies, right? They might sort of find that this is a time where they might masturbate, but they don't know that masturbation is sexual, right? They just know like touching themselves there feels good. And so again, I try to like, where could, this is my ego taking over, right? Where could Freud have gotten these ideas? Besides his mom being young and nice, right? And that's the only thing I could come up with. Freud then argued when you enter school, you enter a period of latency until puberty. These are the school age years where kids are developing their social skills, their educational skills, and becoming more socialized. They tend to play with same-sex peers and avoid kids of the opposite sex. Ew, cooties, that type of thing, right? And then Freud said, if you successfully navigated the 4 stages before this, then you will meet the genital stage. And at the genital stage, that's puberty onward. And your sex drive returns for good. And in Freud's ideal, you start dating. You might have early romantic or sexual experiences. So you start to have intimate relationships. And then you also start to contribute to society by eventually getting a job. Again, Freud argued if you kind of just like check off the boxes, you get to the genital stage, you sort of become a fully formed adult, you're good to go. But again, if at any of these stages, these key tasks or the conflicts aren't resolved, you might become fixated there, or at least partially fixated there. And as an adult, when you're in times of stress, you kind of fall back on those tendencies. And that is where fixation and regression come back in. So there's a certain amount of frustration and anxiety associated with each developmental stage. If the amount of frustration and anxiety is roughly proportional to the amount of gratification you get, things are fine, you move on to the next developmental stage. If the amount of frustration and anxiety is not proportional to the amount of gratification, normal growth may be temporarily halted. And this is what Freud called fixation. And he said it occurs under 2 different conditions. You may have received too little gratification of that stage, so that you're afraid to or unable to move on to the next stage. So for example, a psychodynamic exploration of anorexia nervosa was that it was thought to occur in response to too little gratification at the oral stage. Certainly not a modern interpretation of it. Then the other thing that could happen is you might receive too much gratification during the stage. So there's little or no motivation to move on because you're good there, right? So let's say the individual has been partially fixated at one developmental stage. Let's start with the first one. Let's talk about the oral stage. What that means to Freud is that later in life, when that individual is under stress, they will try to obtain the same type of satisfaction that was appropriate to that earlier stage of development. So if you're partially fixated at the oral stage and you're really stressed out, Freud argued you might continue to seek oral gratification, smoking, drinking, biting your nails, chewing on your pencil, overeating, things along those lines. And this is where regression comes into play. Regression is a developmental phenomenon related to fixation. In regression, the individual seeks to return to an earlier mode of satisfaction. Regression occurs under these conditions of stress. So let's say you have a 9-10-year-old kid. They have to go to the hospital to get surgery. They may show various infantile behaviors. There we go. like crying, thumb sucking, sitting on their mother's lap, things they haven't done in years. And Freud would argue that's regression. Fixation and regression are relative conditions. A person rarely fixates totally, like it would be really rare for someone not to move past the oral stage at all, for example. But it's, it's partial. And each person tends to include some infantilisms in their ways of coping. And these are immature forms of behavior and or predispositions to display childish conduct when thwarted. So for some people, this might be reverting to, oral fixation type ways of gratification. For others, it may be acting childlike when something goes wrong, right? Stomping their foot, yelling, things along those lines. And you know what? This was going to take more than the 2 minutes we have left to describe. So we will pick up with Abraham and Kessler on Wednesday. Everybody stay as dry and warm as you can and take care of yourselves.